Hello again, my name is Des Asante and welcome back to another video quick tip from mixlessons.com. In this episode I wanted to talk a little bit about the compressor and what the controls of a compressor are for and what they accomplish. Now this is not an in-depth tutorial on compression because you could study compression and compression techniques for years and still not know it all. But this is just a quick primer as to what the main controls are for and how you might use them in your own mixes. So what I've got here is an API 2500 plugin. This is a plugin from Waves, and it's a great little compressor. And I chose this one because it's pretty simple in its layout. And so ignore this stuff on the bottom, ignore this stuff on the side. We got our meters and we got our four main controls here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to scroll into the middle of this tune here again, and we're going to listen to this kick drum, and just as an example, some audio that we can work with. So a compressor has basically four main controls. It has the threshold, it has the attack control, it has the ratio, and it has the release control. And in essence, what these things do. Let's start with the threshold. The threshold is simply an indication as to at what dynamic level, at what meter reading do we want the compressor to actually come alive and take some action on our audio, okay? The attack control tells the compressor, okay, once the signal has breached the threshold that we set up originally, how fast is the compressor going to bite that signal and turn it down? Because as you know, as you may know, what compression does is it brings the volume of a track down based on our settings once the track breaches a certain threshold in volume. So the audio goes above a certain dynamic range, a certain dB, excuse me, and the compressor will engage and it will pull the audio down to avoid clipping or to sort of control the peaks and so forth. So once again, the threshold determines at what volume level the compressor actually kicks in. The attack determines how fast is the compressor going to attack that sound and pull it down. Are we going to let some of it pass, or are we going to squash it right away? The third control is the ratio. The ratio is a little, it took me a little longer in the earlier years to wrap my head around, but essentially what the ratio indicates, or what it tells the compressor, is if the signal goes above the threshold by a certain amount, pull it down and only allow it to breach the threshold by a different amount. So for example, it kind of sounds a little confusing, but for example, let's say for example you set the compressor at a ratio of 4:1, which is what we're set at right here, right now. What that means is let's say our threshold is, I don't know, minus 10 dB, okay? So if our volume of our audio signal breaches the threshold by 4 dB, so instead of minus 10, we're all the way up to minus 6, okay? So the audio signal has breached the threshold by 4 dB. The ratio of 4:1 indicates that the compressor is only going to allow the signal to go above the threshold by 1 dB. So it went over by 4, it's going to pull it down so it's only over by 1, if that makes sense to you, is a 4:1 ratio. The higher the ratio, if I did 8:1, then the signal has to go 8 dB. If the signal goes 8 dB above the threshold, the compressor is going to pull it way down so it only breaches by 1 dB. Okay, so an 8:1 ratio is a more drastic compression ratio. If I did a 2:1 ratio, that's a more subtle effect on the audio, if that makes any sense at all. I hope it does. So just to recap, 4:1 means the signal goes over by 4, the compressor pulls it down so it's only over by 1, if that makes any sense to you. Okay, and the last control we have is the release control. And what that says is once you've the signal has breached the threshold, the compressor kicked in based as fast as we've set the attack to. It kicked in and pulled the audio down based on how we've set the ratio. And then how long are we going to allow the compressor to release the audio back up to its original unaffected, unprocessed state? So that's what the release time does, okay? So let's bring in our kick drum and just play with these for a second. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my threshold a little more aggressively until I start to see a little more action in the meters here. I'm going to go pretty far. So now we're getting about minus Oh, in some cases, between -7 and -12 dB of gain reduction, I can see on my meters here, the compressor is pulling down the audio by between, -6 and -10 or so, -12 or so dB, okay? And I pulled it up that far so we can kind of hear what's going on. Now let's mess with the attack. How fast is the compressor going to react on the sound? I'm going to get a very fast attack here. And a slow attack. You'll notice when I increase the attack time, when I make it slower, it lets some of the punch through. It lets some of the initial transient through, which kind of adds a little bit of attack, a little bit of point on the kick drum to come through before the compressor pulls the volume down. So that's a matter of personal decision as to what's more appropriate for the tune and the track at hand. But that's kind of the effect that it has. So a fast attack is going to really cut off those peaks and smooth out the transient response, and a slower attack is going to let that transient pop through before the compressor pulls it down. And then again, if I get this playing, we'll play with the ratio here. A very subtle ratio. You look what's happening in the gain, in the meters here, getting a very low amount of gain reduction. As I increase that ratio, I'm getting quite a bit more gain reduction. And you can hear it in the audio. It starts to sound a little more squashed, a little more quote-unquote compressed, right? And then let's mess around with the release time, which might not be as obvious on a kick drum because it's a very short sound. It doesn't have a lot of sustain to it. But let's play with it here and see if we can hear any difference. Not a lot of perceivable difference on the kick drum track because, like I say, it is a very short sustained instrument. You would hear the release time a little more on something that has a bit more sustain to it, a guitar or a bass line or something like that. And perhaps in future videos we'll cover different instruments and different ways to apply this stuff. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into at least what the controls on a compressor do, and I hope that it helps you to be able to use the compressors in your DAW a little more effectively, and to start to think outside the box of some different methods and different techniques that you could use a compressor for to achieve certain sounds that you're looking for. So again, I hope that helps you, and we'll see you on the next mixlessons.com quick tip. As mentioned, mixlessons.com is part of the TechMuse Academy. To learn more about the TechMuse Academy or to subscribe to the TechMuse podcast, visit www.techmuse.ca.